This episode was recorded on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation.
Hello and welcome to POSLink Plus Listen. My name is David O'Keefe and I am the coordinator of the Positive Speakers Bureau at Living Positive Victoria. Today I'm talking to Robert about his lived experience of HIV and HIV-associated Neurocognitive Disorder, or HAND. Please enjoy the episode. Hello, Robert, and to start the show, can you tell us a little bit about yourself to share with this audience?
Yep, sure. I'm a New Zealander. I was born and raised in a small town in New Zealand. I was the youngest of three boys. Growing up, I was not your typical Kiwi. I didn't like rugby. I didn't like cricket. Much preferred swimming. I liked walking in the native forest, reading, drawing and painting. I did pretty well at high school, but I couldn't wait to get out of high school. I was already starting to feel, being a gay boy, that there was more to life than that small town could offer me. So from there I moved down to Wellington. I lived in Auckland for a while, did a bit of traveling around the Pacific, and lived in Australia as well. In 79 I moved to the United Kingdom, and that's kind of where my story begins in terms of HIV.
So would you like to expand on that process then from 79 onwards, that journey with HIV? How did that begin, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I arrived in London and intending on a 6-month holiday with a friend of mine. Arrived 79, beginning of summer. Disco was hot. The gay scene was jumping, lots of drugs, lots of sex, and I ended up staying there for something like 39 years on and off, also living in the United States. Yeah, so I was there in the early 80s when HIV began to, emerge into the gay community. So I sort of witnessed all the kind of discomfort that came from this sort of slow creeping of these strange new illnesses that were affecting the community, and this attempt by the community to cope with that in different ways. I remember being at a bar in the United States where over the PA they said, "There's nothing to worry about. We disinfect our glasses, at boiling." And so I don't think people people obviously couldn't understand what was going on at that stage. And it wasn't until the virus was identified that, we understood exactly what was going on. And then, of course, there was a hell of a backlash, from that the way in which the condition was characterized was that it was a death sentence. It was God's retribution on sodomites, on drug dealers, on drug users, whores, people of color. It was, so it was a very, and that was a time where I think, within the gay community, we all reacted in different ways. I had, people I knew and a ex-partner who passed away, and at that time, because in that very early stage, there was basically only AZT, and that was a harrowing experience, its own, and it didn't always work. And so I saw these friends and an ex-partner pass away, in really harrowing circumstances. So So that was my experience of HIV, and my decision was that I didn't want to know whether I was positive or not until I absolutely had to. Sure. I didn't want what I saw was that for people I knew who were dealing with HIV, their lives were becoming medicalized. They were being defined in terms of a disease, which it is not, So I just sort of set it aside. I just withdrew from the gay scene, led a pretty quiet life. I had a full-time job, had a small circle of friends, all straight friends. And so I was basically, in a sense, just not interested, not dealing, pushing it away in effect. But I knew that probably the time would come when I would have to accept that I needed to know, and that happened when I began to develop psoriasis, which is a condition of the skin, and it became very bad. I actually got psoriatic arthritis, and it wasn't until one of the dermatologists, a new dermatologist, asked, had I been tested? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, there's a possibility that very high levels of a virus in your system are actually causing that reaction, because psoriasis is an immune response condition. So I knew it was the time had come that I had to have a test.
So and this was still in the UK at this
stage?
Yeah,
that was in 2003. So from 83 to 2003, I was... I didn't have I'm not conscious of even having a seroconversion, and I know for others that seroconversion is actually a very, it's a very rough process, going through. I don't remember ever having anything like that.
Sure. So Robert, just backtracking a little bit. So from the, say, 1980s, early 1980s up to 2003 when you were diagnosed, how did you negotiate, say, your sexual activity or within that period?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of HIV, I was still partying, and I was having safe sex, so I took care of that. I think I didn't live as a hermit. I had a good social life. I just wasn't in the gay scene, and it was partly, I don't think may not have been that much about HIV, although HIV was a factor, and it was also just getting on with life, and during that period, I pursued a very successful career. I mean, I was living in 83, and I was living as a squatter in Brixton, and then in 2003, I think I was about to become assistant director in a local council in London. So, I was negotiating that career. I also completed a master's, doing at Birkbeck College. So I was working full time and studying part time. So I had a very full life. It was just not going to be about HIV.
Sure.
That was my decision.
I suppose then that leads us then to the process of diagnosis.
Yeah.
If you want to kind of expand on that, and what was the process? How you kind of again managed to work that through, issues of disclosure to deciding who to tell and when to tell them.
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on in there. First of all, diagnosis. Diagnosis was the test, the results, the doctor saying you're positive, and for reasons that have to do with my family upbringing, my response was, okay, now I'm positive. Now I just need to get on with it. I wasn't. I knew what HIV was. I knew the effect it could have. I knew that, that basically I now had to deal with it. And I was sort of, it was good to hear from the doctors that the medical regimes, of course, in 20 years had really progressed from those very early days. And so I started on a medical regime. And it didn't really change anything first of all, when I was diagnosed, I had a viral load of 144,000 and a CD4 count of 4. So, it was...
Not good.
It was, it had basically the virus had ravaged my immune system. And for some reason, which, doesn't, I don't know, could ever be explained. I wasn't having any of those, the kind of, the illnesses and that come along with those opportunistic diseases and things that, so affected those that I knew. My upbringing when I was I grew up in a family where my father was he was born in 1897. He went to Gallipoli. He fought on Gallipoli. His father was on Gallipoli, and his father died there. And then my father went on and fought in the First World War in France. Now, I didn't recognize this until many years later, long after he passed away. That experience for him created a kind of a hard core, and he pervade to the family that if you've got problems, you don't complain, you deal with it. You don't complain in this household. So, that was, in that upbringing, that was the thing. You just get on with it. So that was the response I had to HIV. And so, I think I hear others talk about their experience of diagnosis, and it's always so very different. And that's how it's different for me. But after that, we go on for something like 15 years where, I'm different med regimes, my viral load is undetectable, my CD4, CD4 count is going up, I sort of hovering about 350. So, and I'm doing well. I'm, have an independent small consultancy doing project and change management. But all that changed in 2018, which brings us on to the topic of HAN. So I was actually living in Sydney when the first symptoms came on in 2018.
So what happened in 2018, Robert, that has led us to talk about what this today?
Yeah.
And what, if you can just explain what HAND means too.
Okay, well, HAND is HIV associated neurological disorder. And it occurs when the virus escapes into the central nervous system. So it's undetectable through simple blood tests, and the only way to detect it is to have a lumbar puncture, which is where the spinal fluid is tapped, and then through that, the diagnosis it can be made for the escape, and then medication can follow. But so for me, the first symptoms were my hands were trembling slightly. I sort of was a little unsteady on my feet. I went to my GP. I never told my GP that I was positive. But my GP sent me for an MRI scan. So moving into 2019, the tremors were getting worse. I was having trouble with knife and fork. I had spontaneous jerks, and I was working at that stage. So we'd go out for work lunches, and I would always have to have something that I could have in my hands. I couldn't have anything that I could eat with a knife and fork, because the danger was that I would throw a piece of food inadvertently out, off the plate. So it was sort of getting progressively worse. I was also I had a couple of falls on the stairs. So when I was negotiating the stairs, I had to hang on to the banister. So I was things were just getting a bit, getting very unsettling and unsettled. So through the HIV clinic that I was going to, I was referred again for an MRI scan. But at that point, I was just on the edge of a precipice so I just, within a month, I was virtually almost paralyzed. I had difficulty walking. I was stumbling and falling. I had to kneel down in the shower because, the danger was I was going to slip. I was so unsteady. I couldn't open a can of food. I couldn't write my own name.
Are you still in the workplace at this?
No. I actually left the workplace before I went over the edge. I was, it was clear that I was having difficulty, and unfortunately, I had a very unsympathetic workplace at that stage, and I just had to make clear to them that I was having problems of mobility, and that I need to need to leave, had to, would finish. So I gave notice, and that was I think it was in early 2019. And the interesting thing about HAND for me was that for some it actually affects the mental capacity. Mine was all physical. I was mentally quite alert, and did a lot of reading, got an addiction to Sudoku because you can just sit there and press little, and I could at least do that,
Sure.
But, that took me really, really right down. It was, at that point, it was like being totally wiped clean. It was like I was like a reboot. When you reboot a computer, you go down to the most basic, and then you restart. So the MRI scan came back and I saw it, and my brain was sort of like had this white fuzz. I was then referred to a neurologist at St Vincent's, and he did called for the the lumbar puncture, and the lumbar puncture revealed I had a viral load of, I think it was 3,600 in my central nervous system, but it was not it was not detectable in the blood. It was only through the the lumbar puncture.
Did you have support at this stage?
No, I didn't ask for support.
Okay, yeah.
I would I went it alone. And we're going to come to that in a while. I went it completely alone, except for my doctor at the sexual health clinic, who was she was very caring and very understanding and very sympathetic. And I think she tried to sort of break my shell, very gently, but she was not successful because the carapace was so hard at that point, So, I was diagnosed, and so I was put onto a new meds regime, which is far more potent, apparently. And it was remarkable because the neurologist said, it may take you 6 months, 12 months to recover. You may never fully recover from this. But within 3 months, I was back. I was recovered enough to go back onto the market and find a job. Because what I was facing at the lowest point was, I didn't know what would my life be like. Would I be disabled for the rest of my life in this way? Unable to move. How bad would all this get? But there was, for the process was like, I talked about it being like a reboot, and I was, I had this experience which was like, sort of this moment when the whole thing clicked for me and changed. I was shortly after I was able to walk enough to walk in the local park in Parramatta. I sort of came to a stop at this on a path I was walking. This was early morning. It was winter, and I like to walk in the early morning, so it was still dark, perfectly still night, and this kind of silence fell on me, and it was like I just felt, I'm so glad to be alive. It's only looking back at it that I recognize how important that moment was. So I stood there, and it was almost like a cliche, really. The moon was setting over the top of the trees. It was just totally still and silent, and I knew, I just was so glad to be alive. And at that point, I recognized, if I can survive this, I can survive anything. At that moment, it was kind of like, I was sort of standing in this kind of vista open before me, sort of sense of possibility and potential. And, up until that point, I hadn't told my family what I'd been going through, or any of my friends. And my ex-partner, who was, it was in the United States. And, so I talked to them about it, and they said, what the hell were you doing? Why didn't you talk to us? We would have been there for you. And I know they would have been. In that moment, I just flicked into a totally different way of looking at the world, about the things I wanted to do, the life I wanted to live, the people I wanted to have in my life, and the kind of relationship I wanted to have with those people.
I can imagine. And, having to retell each time can be difficult as well.
Yeah, but, I don't know. For me, it's a story that I think, it's a story I want to tell. Where sometimes, when I say, well, how on earth can you talk about HIV bringing a blessing into your life? Well, here, this happened, and without that experience, I wouldn't be where I am now, which is, where I'm, my family say that I'd completely changed, that I was a different person.
And do you see that in yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Prior to that, I was very materially focused. It's all about money and about, getting on. And maybe it came at a point as well where I was, on the point of thinking about retirement. And so I didn't need to think so much about make a career of things.
So that's 2019. So you're still living in Parramatta or Sydney at this stage?
No. I moved to Melbourne about 3 years ago because I was retiring, and I was sort of thinking about where I was going to retire to, what kind of I wanted to have a reasonable quality of life, and I was sick and tired of the city, so I was thinking about maybe going into rural New South Wales. And came down to Melbourne for Christmas with family, and we all got COVID.
Oh.
So we were stuck there for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And, just opened my eyes, and they were saying, well, why don't you come down to Melbourne? I said, yeah, why not?
In that process, you've become a volunteer at Living Positive Victoria.
Yeah.
And you've become also a member of the Positive Speakers Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain how that has changed you or benefited you in terms of engagement then when telling your story, Robert?
Well, before I do that,
Sure.
one of the things I want to sort of say is that, there's the two sides of me. Before that hand experience, I was a gay man who was HIV positive. After that, I began to think of myself as someone who is positive, who's also gay. And so I started to, because I look back on the way HIV had been in my life, and I recognized how much it had figured in the decisions and in the things that had happened in my life. And I also felt that for other positive people who may be going through what I went through, I want them to know that no matter how bad it gets, you can recover and do it the way that works for you. And if you can, look for support, and I think when I think back in the way that I do it with family and friends, is I think I was so selfish that I didn't share with them, because that's what you do, for those you love. You don't shut them out from this thing that is so powerful. That point, I wanted to engage with other positive people and maybe share my story to see, if it resonated, if it sort of helped, if there was, and then, got in contact with Living Positive Victoria, and, was, so welcomed, and I did a positive reflection session which is the first time I'd shared my experience with other positive people, and then all the experiences that were reflected back to me, all the experiences that was so rich and enriching, just this all the different ways in which we've lived with being positive, and the sense of support and love and care that's there. So that at that point, I thought, yeah, I want to be more involved with Living Positive, in ways that, if I can bring my experience and skills, that's what I want to do. And my engagement with Living Positive has been great. Was a member of the Speakers Bureau, and, I've spoken to people and shared the story, talked about particular ways in which my story might inflect the work they do or the experiences that they're having. And just get this incredible feedback and just this incredible interest in what it means to be positive and what my experience has been as a positive gay man.
If you had the possibility of going back in time, you had a time machine, when would you go back to, and what words of advice would you give yourself?
That's the wrong question. I would never go back.
Yeah.
If I went back, I was asked this once in one of the Speakers Bureau sessions, or I think it was on a training session. If I went back to me in the partying in the 70s and 80s, what advice would I give? And I sort of had to think about it for a while, and then I just say, go, guy.
Enjoy yourself.
Enjoy yourself. I wouldn't. I can't change anything, so I wouldn't want to change anything. I wouldn't be who I am now without having gone through what I have done. And a lot of what I am now is because because I've been HIV positive.
Sure. Thank you very much, Robert, for sharing your story with us today. I really appreciate your time and in terms of coming in to see us and chat, and wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you enjoy this episode of POSLink Plus Listen? You can find more episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date. For more information, head to lpv.org.au and join us on our social channels.